Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Norman Sauce, and I serve the school district as Chief of Student Services. Before we go any further, we want to invite our participants who are looking for the place to go for interpretation services to look for the globe at the bottom of your screen and to click the globe, which will then give you the language to select for which room you can then enter. Ms. McMurray, did you want to translate that?
Buenas noches a todos. Antes de comenzar esta reunión, queremos dejarles saber que si necesita escuchar esta reunión en español, por favor, haga clic en el globo localizado en la parte inferior de la pantalla y seleccione el idioma. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Ms. McMurray. Again, my name is Norman Sauce, and I very proudly serve DeKalb County School District as Chief of Student Services. We really appreciate your eagerness, enthusiasm to join us this evening as we talk about and seek to inform and educate our stakeholders about various aspects of gifted education. We're going to get into that a little bit further in a few moments. Before we go further into our agenda and introduce other folks, we're very, very excited to have our superintendent, Dr. Devon Q. Horton, on with us this evening. So I know Dr. Horton would like to address our stakeholders before we go any further. So Dr. Horton?
Yes. Good evening, Dr. Sauce and families. Thank you all for taking the time this evening to learn more about the work that as we go ready to go deeper with our gifted and talented programming. It's an exciting time for us here in our district as we continue to disrupt for excellence by lifting new levels and new heights. This is a journey that the district has been on, I would say, for maybe the last 6 months. What I want to highlight here is that while gifted and talented has always been in our district, and we have some phenomenal leaders that have been leading it, we decided to kind of shift a little bit. And we shifted to now where we can actually have Dr. Sauce's department. It's brand new within the last 6 months, and it focuses on gifted and talented, our ELL, early learning, and special education. And so these are departments that oftentimes get overlooked. And I know sometimes we don't think about gifted and talented when we're looking through the lens of equity, but there are major inequities in our gifted and talented, not just access, but also in service. And so we want to really build capacity. And tonight you'll learn a little bit more about like step one, as we made some really significant shifts that's going to help provide more opportunity for our students. So thank you all again for being here. Our school board is excited, our community, as I'm hearing the different voices from parents about the access. We're ready to roll. So thank you, Dr. Sauce, and I'm looking forward to a great webinar.
Appreciate that, sir. Thank you very much. And team, we are really excited. This evening is an exceptional collaboration between our new Division of Student Services, which Dr. Horton just referenced, which of course includes our gifted education team. Also our communications team, who helped us to broadly promote this event and address our logistics for this evening so that we can have a successful webinar. And of course, our English Learners Department, which includes our team of interpreters who are also assisting us to provide this information in various languages so that the message can be far and wide and broad. So with that being said, if you would please advance the slide. Okay, thank you so much. This slide here represents several critical anchors of the work in DeKalb County School District, certainly anchors for the work that have led us here this evening to invite this conversation, to share about what's happening with gifted education, and obviously to respond to questions as best we can. The top left of the screen is what you see, what we call our Miracles framework. Miracles is an acronym. As you see, each letter stands for a different tenet. And these tenets drive and motivate and influence our work in every division and in schoolhouses every single day. This is a part of the shift that's come about in our district under our new superintendent, Dr. Horton. And furthermore, for folks to know, each division has priorities that are established that align to these miracles tenets, where each month we are making progress towards those priorities, and we're reporting out to our executive cabinet, to members of our Board of Education, with results then published on our website, so that folks can track our progress every 30 days in how much success we're having or what barriers we may be experiencing, what support is needed. Basically, where are we with the progress we've committed to for each of the priorities we've established, each of which align to that framework. That's a part of our accountability to the community. And some of the work you're going to hear about this evening, some of the information you'll learn about this evening is certainly tied to various tenets of the Miracles framework. We also have a brand new strategic plan that was just approved by our Board of Education in June of this year. And we're so excited that we had such broad input, broad stakeholder participation in the development of that strategic plan. You see in the middle of the screen there, DCSD goal areas. While of course this is just a minor snippet of the strategic plan, these 6 goal areas represent the pillars of the strategic plan. And within each of those goal areas, there are particular action steps that the district is committed to taking, and particular performance measures, key performance indicators that we'll be tracking along the way over the next 5 years aligned to those goal areas. Certainly some of the work that you're going to hear about this evening is tied directly to several of the goal areas that you see there on the screen. And lastly, we have our 6 systems. Said shortly there, 6 systems, but we call them our 6 essential systems. And these systems represent aspects of the work in the schoolhouse. These 6 systems represent comprehensive ways for schools to go about their business on a day-to-day basis, to provide the most effective, most essential learning environments that we possibly can for all of our students. If you were to ask any teacher, or certainly any principal or administrator in your child's school, they should all be familiar with the 6 systems and understand how the 6 systems envelop and encompass each other to then allow our district to put forward the most impactful learning environments that we possibly can. As far as accountability, each school, various points in the year, presents to their area superintendent teams and to various district leaders what sort of progress they're making on providing for the 6 systems to ensure that they are the most impactful learning environments possible for our students. And they, of course, get feedback along the way and solicit additional support along the way so that those 6 systems can be actualized. And again, some of what you'll hear about this evening directly ties in and relates to the 6 systems and our efforts in the Division of Student Services to carry that work forward in support of our schools. So I appreciate you allowing me to lay those out. Just wanted to make sure to discuss the anchors of the work before we go further. With that being said, I do want to invite 2 very important folks to introduce themselves, who are going to be our primary speakers this evening. First is Ms. Kristen Drake, one of our senior coordinators for gifted education. Ms. Drake.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Appreciate that, Ms. Drake. Secondly, we have one of our other senior coordinators for gifted education, and that is Ms. Danielle Atkinson. Ms. Atkinson.
Good evening. Thanks for being here.
Awesome. Thank you, Ms. Atkinson. So team, as we proceed into, you can go to the next slide. As we proceed to the content here, Ms. Drake and Ms. Atkinson are going to be our primary presenters from here on out. As we referenced, you can certainly put questions in the chat, not in the chat, rather in the Q&A feature. And we see that some questions are already coming through. That's great. We're going to pause at different junctures of the presentation to address questions as much as we can as they come. And if there are more questions than we feasibly have time to respond to tonight, we'll just wait and see. Then we very well may offer written responses after the fact on our gifted tab of our webpage for our district website. But we'll see depending on how many questions we have. So feel free to type your questions. Some already are. We'll pause at different junctures to address them. And I'm going to let Ms. Drake go ahead and speak now about what is giftedness. Ms. Drake, you're on.
Thank you. So first, I'm going to give you the definition of giftedness from the National Association for Gifted Children. And that is that students have gifts and talents, and they have the capability to perform, or they do perform, at higher levels compared to their peers. They do require modifications to their education. So to learn and realize their potential, we have to accommodate their needs. It's important to note, again, this was redefined by the National Association for Gifted Children, or NAGC, in recent years. We want to note that they come from all racial, ethnic, and cultural populations, as well as all economic strata. They do require access to appropriate learning opportunities. Again, the focus is on realizing their potential. They can have learning and processing disorders that might require intervention and accommodation, and they need support and guidance to grow socially and emotionally.
Ms. Drake, if I could pause you there for a moment, one thing that I want to add to this part of the discussion is it's important that we also define that as it relates to education and giftedness, where of course we recognize every child, of course, has gifts, and we seek to uplift and elevate and bring those gifts out. So also important to note that every state defines gifted education differently. There is not federal statute that governs gifted education as there is with special education or even English learner services. So from state to state, you can have very different definitions, explanations of funding mechanisms, service definitions, etc., of what giftedness is or maybe isn't in a particular state. We don't reference that in the slide, but we also want to provide that for context that it's going to vary by state.
Excellent point. Thank you. That's a perfect transition to the next slide, which is the Georgia Department of Education's definition of giftedness. And they define giftedness as students who demonstrate a high degree of intellectual or creative ability, a high degree of motivation, and they excel in academic fields. Again, that's the definition from the Georgia Department of Education. And then on the next slide, we're going to talk about what the Davidson Institute says about common characteristics of gifted children. They comprehend material several grade levels above their peers. They have surprising emotional depth and sensitivity. They have a strong sense of curiosity, and they have unique interests and topics and they're enthusiastic about those areas of interest. They have a mature sense of humor. Typically, they're creative problem solvers, and they have imaginative expression. They absorb information very quickly with little repetition needed. They are self-aware, socially aware, and aware of global issues. And again, that's from the Davidson Institute.
We're going to
here. Just are there any questions?
Yeah, we're going to pause there. We do have some questions, so we're going to take them as they come, a few at a time, and then we're going to transition to our next section. The first question reads, several elementary schools in our district utilize different gifted models, cluster, advanced content, and pullout. The students seem to be receiving extremely differentiated services amongst them. Will this be corrected going forward? Okay, I'm going to speak to that, and then Ms. Atkinson is going to speak more in depth about service models a little bit later in the presentation. The first thing I would offer is we thank you for the question, respect and appreciate very much the question. Respect and appreciate that folks may see or experience differently what gifted services look like from school to school. From our lens as the Division of Student Services, we do not dictate to schools which service models must be used. We represent guidance, support, assistance, recommendations. There's an infinite number of factors that a principal and his or her team has to consider when deciding which service models to go with, everything from how many gifted students they have in their school to which teachers have gifted endorsement. So first of all, we wouldn't dictate that elementary schools A, B, and C must use this service model. Middle school C, D, and E have to use that service model. High school have to use this service model. It doesn't look like that. But what we do offer is, and Ms. Drake will speak to this a little bit later in the presentation as well, is a common experience as far as developing our teachers' capacity to become gifted endorsed. We're one of the few districts in the area that offers our own gifted endorsement program. It allows us to have quality control around how our teachers are being trained, developed, and supported around how to best support gifted students. So that's the gist of the answer we can give to that question in the moment, but did want to speak to that and I appreciate the question. I see a question here. What is the point of locating more gifted kids if we aren't even serving the ones we already have identified? I appreciate the question. I'll offer to you that we've done some pretty deep analysis as far as the percentage of students that we have gifted identified that we've served. We can tell you that last school year, we had over 10,000 students gifted identified, and 99% of those we know through scheduling data were served through an appropriate served model. So certainly there could be room to have further discussion at the school level with an individual principal of their team. But just for clarity, we know that 99% of our gifted students were served last year, and we've already had direct collaboration and conversation with the school administrations of those schools that did have a few students that weren't served for some reason. Going to do one or two more here, Miss Atkinson, and then you're going to go into the next section. Next question says, will parents registered for the meeting receive this recording? We will work with our communications department to make this recording available on our gifted website. And then I see one more question, and then Ms. Atkinson, back to you. Will federal funding be impacted by any changes being planned? No. And furthermore, to go back to what I said in the beginning of the discussion, gifted education is very differently defined and provided for from state to state, and does not come with it any accompanying federal dollars. That is not the case, say, with special education. That is not the case with English learners programming, but gifted education does not have any federal dollars attached to it, unlike these other special programs. We're going to come back to Ms. Atkinson and move into the next section, and we'll keep getting to as many questions as we can as we go. Okay, and if you could, there we go.
So as we talk about gifted identification and what it looks like, of course, as Dr. Sauce and as my colleague Kristen Drake shared with you, it does vary from state to state. We are fortunate in the state of Georgia that permits at least some form of criteria, some form of guideline, some form of guidance that all districts within the state of Georgia should uphold to. So as students transition from one county to the next within of our state, we all had adhered to the same criteria and guidance set forth by the state. Now, where it is going to look different from county to county will be our identification process. And I can't wait to share with you what opportunities we have afforded our students this school term. Next slide. So I want to bring to your attention categories and domains and options in which our students are able to be identified as gifted. Let's start first with the domains, or better yet, the categories. The state of Georgia requires that a student be deemed gifted eligible for services if they meet 3 out of the 4 areas. That these domains are mental ability, achievement, creativity, and motivation. One of those has to be a norm reference assessment, and I'll get into that a bit later. The next one would be option A. Option A is applicable for those students who have been screened, met the state's criteria in mental ability, and has also satisfied the achievement criteria. Option B means that those students has been screened in all 4 domains, and they meet at least 3 out of those 4, with one of those being mental ability and achievement. I want to break down for you what the state requires, or what the state defines as mental ability. Mental ability is our IQ, or it is also seen as an intelligence or cognitive ability test. Many of you are familiar with it as the cognitive ability test, the COGAT, as what we call it here in DeKalb. But it is a normed reference assessment, and it measures the intelligence or cognitive ability of students. The achievement domain achievement scores are acquired from a total battery. Typically, these are again on a norm reference assessment that tests the student's academia through a total battery in reading and or mathematics. Creativity, that score is derived from a standardized assessment that's based on creative thinking and or characteristics in the areas of fluency, originality, and elaboration. And of course, last but not least, is motivation. Again, that assessment is evaluated with students using motivational characteristics based on a structured observation form that adheres to a motivational behaviors of students that a teacher would more than likely see exhibited in the classroom. Well, what is motivation, Ms. Atkinson? Well, some of those behaviors, without giving you a laundry list of them, but to add would be a student's leadership ability, meaning when a teacher has the child in small group and without giving notice or being told to go ahead and organize that group of 4 to say, hey, you're good at writing, you be the secretary, and already delegating those duties. That take charge attitude. The next motivational behavior that may be exhibited would be the student that goes beyond the expectation of what the teacher has asked. The next would be a child who chooses not to take the easiest task. Another one would be willing to take a risk. And or even though I'm frustrated, I'm not giving up. Before the day is over, I'm going to see that through. So that's just a snippet of those domains in which our students are being assessed. Next slide.
Ms. Atkinson, actually, if you
Yes,
could go
sir.
back for a second.
Okay.
Thank you. Before we go to the next slide, and actually, if you could speak a little bit about options A and B, for clarity, does that then mean that at least the way the state of Georgia defines it, students, could they be gifted in math, gifted in reading, gifted in writing, or is it more specific to these categories?
Well, it's more specific. That's a great question. I'm glad that you asked it. And although these are areas in which students are assessed, doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they're gifted in. It is a strong suit, and we most certainly in the classroom want to see those strengths enhanced as well as deepen and strengthen, but not necessarily saying that I'm gifted in mathematics, or I'm gifted in band, or I'm gifted in visual arts. These are just attributes and components of which I express my giftedness.
Could you also unpack a little bit about the varying pathways here that we see with options A and B to qualify for gifted?
Sure, and actually I can go a little bit more deeper further on in the slide, but yes. So here, and I don't want to confuse anyone when I say option A means that a student has a complete composite score in mental ability, meaning the COGAT. We're all familiar with that assessment. So a student in grades K through 2 who meets the state's criteria of a 99 percentile on the complete composite, which means the entire assessment. Again, before I move forward, they are assessed in verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal. That makes up the complete composite score. So a student that's in grades K through 2 that meet the complete composite score of a 99 percentile and have met the reading or math component of the achievement, meaning the math assessment at 90% or higher, in either reading or math, does not have to be both, then there's no more further evaluation needed. They are deemed gifted, and then the local school is to serve them and make sure the grade placement is correct. Creativity and motivation data is just acquired. Because data has to be collected in all 4 areas, it's just collected but not moved towards their eligibility. Option B, on the other hand, this is where now we're using the subtests of these assessments to qualify, meaning in mental ability, off of the COGAT assessment, students are evaluated, as I said before, in verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal. The state requires a score of a 96% or higher in order to deem a yes as this domain to satisfy that criteria. Achievement would also be your math assessment, 90% or higher in either reading or math, does not have to be both. Creativity would be your 90% or higher and motivation 90% or higher. The combination of those for option B will vary. It could be a child has a yes for mental ability, a yes for creativity, a yes for motivation, but a no for achievement. This could also be a child that has a yes for achievement, no for mental ability, but yes in the area or the domains of creativity and motivation. It can be a mixture of any of those three dynamics as I shared, but it has to be at least one of a norm reference assessment in either mental ability or achievement. I hope that answered your question without adding confusion. Next slide. Again, this breaks down the guidance as it appears in the Georgia DOE's resource manual, which lets us know that while option A and B are used to gather information in the 4 domains or categories as they call them, only one of those needs to meet the norm reference criteria domain, which is either in mental ability and or achievement. I want to draw caution as parents have students that are going through the gifted identification process where we get down into the rating scales, meaning the creativity and motivation, which is through our Renzulli. The Renzulli is a teacher rating scale that satisfies both creativity or motivation. However, the guidance from the Georgia DOE indicates that if we use the creativity for Renzulli, then we cannot use Renzulli for motivation. We must use another assessment in its place because the two cannot be side by side. This is where it is going to vary from LEAs, better known as the local school district, meaning based off those approved state assessments, based on how their systemic approach is to identifying the students, but we all have to adhere to the first 6 bullets that are shared here on this slide. Next slide. So here is DeKalb County's uniqueness. This is a flow chart. This is in visual terms, all of the verbiage I shared in the first 2-3 slides. The first one shares the different pathways in which a student in DeKalb can become identified or go through the identification process. The first as we know it, and again, I want to say first, the district offers or implements an annual automated process in which students come to the table. There are no paperwork, there isn't anything, a call that a parent has to make. It is done automatically through the MAP assessment as our universal screener. Should students meet that 90% or higher, then they will be eligible for further testing. The added advantage that Dr. Horton and Dr. Sauce mentioned today is the other nuances that we have developed that will allow additional opportunities for our students. Dr. Sauce likes to call it an at-bat, and so I'll use his language with us this evening. If a child takes the MAP assessment and does not meet the state's 90%, then guess what? The game is not over. Our students will have an opportunity if they meet within the range of 75% to 89% in reading or math. Does not have to be both. In reading or math, they hit a range of 75 to 89 percentile. They too will be able to move forward. Now, they will then take the ITBS. Those that meet the 90% or higher in reading or math from the MAP, they will move on and take the COGAT. We also found through our query as we dug deeper into how can we expand opportunities for our students to come to the table to receive gifted services, we learned that there were students that meet both the creativity and motivation from the Renzulli. So it wasn't that maybe the teachers did not have an insight on their students. These were students that were making the mark. However, they just did not have a favorable map or did not, because they did not have a 90%, the game was over for them. Not this year. We are allowing those students to come to the table and be assessed with the COGAT. From there, they will then move forward with the remaining assessments that we offer. This will be conducted twice, yes, twice during the school year. The first one will take place in September, and then the next one will take place second semester in February. As you see here, in order for us to move forward after the math administration, we must have your consent in order to move forward with the remaining assessment. But based on the number of attendants and participants here, 457, I believe you all will walk away having a clearer understanding of this process, and then allow those students of yours that meet this or fall within one of these top 3 bubbles be able to move forward in our identification process. Next slide.
Ms. Atkinson, if you don't mind,
Yes,
we're gonna pause for a second to address
Okay.
the questions. And if you could go
Okay.
back, please, to the previous slide. We have a good number of questions coming through, all great questions.
Okay.
And as we speak to some questions that have come through in the chat, whereas this flow chart is intended as a as a quick handy visual, I want to harken back to some things that Ms. Atkinson just referenced. During the May 6, 2024 Board of Education meeting, we gave a full comprehensive presentation to our Board of Education around some historical data associated with our gifted services, particularly demographic data, special program participation data. And we did identify that there were percentages of students. There were certainly numbers of students from historically underrepresented groups that had not had the same access or opportunity to participate in gifted education. Whereas this evening is not intended to rehash or represent what's already been shared with the public, this flow chart represents additional steps, additional at-bats for additional children to be considered through more doorways, if you will. If you recall some content that Ms. Atkinson just spoke to a few slides ago, where she talks about in the state of Georgia, there are multiple avenues for which a student can be considered for gifted education. Historically, in the recent past in DeKalb, and we're not alone in this regard as far as other school districts, we've been relying heavily on, or solely on MAP, not heavily, I should say solely, on MAP as the only point of entry. While MAP is a very important tool, a very important indicator, and certainly an approved assessment for gifted education in the state of Georgia for the achievement domain, it's not the only doorway that the state of Georgia says can exist for kids to be further considered for gifted education. So this flow chart represents additional doorways, additional at-bats, if you will, that we're providing for going forward as part of our new strategic plan, as part of our commitment to equity and access and inclusion. But either way, a student has to meet the state's criteria described already in Ms. Atkinson's slides in order to participate in gifted education. So that doesn't change, and that's a state DOE regulation. If you qualify, you qualify. There are a number of questions in the chat, so let's pull up a few. And folks, there's more questions than we're going to have time to speak to, so we're going to take what we don't get to and provide written responses on our website after this meeting. I can just tell you now. So one question is, what leeway is there in the acceleration guidelines for a gifted student performing at a higher level than peers? Great question. Thank you for that. To be clear, grade acceleration and gifted education are not the same things. Whereas certainly a gifted student may qualify for grade acceleration, they are not synonymous. So what I would offer is, if you think your child might be a candidate for grade acceleration, through our curriculum and instruction division, there are board policy and regulations around around grade acceleration. I would encourage you to connect with your child's teacher and your child's school administration to seek to begin discussions and potentially engage the process around grade acceleration, but not to be confused with gifted. They are not synonymous. The next question says, one of my students was in the gifted program last year. Will she continue each year, or will she have to test to continue? So two-part question there. First of all, for clarity, gifted is not a program. Gifted education is a required service in the state of Georgia, just as special education, just as English learner services, just as Section 504 services. So it's not a program per se, but it's a service your child either does or does not qualify for. And no, they do not have to test every year. you know, when they get in, they remain in unless they can get put on probation if there's you know, certain academic slippage, which the teacher and the school's principal would speak to the parents about to avoid that. But generally, no, they don't need to retest to remain with the service. Forgive me, I'm going to do 2 or 3 more. There's a question here about dual identification. For example, if a child has autism, could they potentially be qualified for gifted services? Great question. The answer is yes, absolutely. One thing that we noticed in this deep dive that I talked about earlier that we presented to the Board of Education on May 6th was there were far too few students who were receiving special education services, of which autism could be one of the qualifiers, that were also receiving gifted education services. So we recognize that our previous practices were presenting barriers for students, say with exceptional education needs, also students who are English learners, potentially being considered for gifted education. So this slide that Ms. Atkinson already spoke to that demonstrates these multiple pathways that we're now going to consider and utilize to further consider additional students for gifted education is a way to provide such students with more access potentially to gifted education. Ms. Atkinson, I'm going to let you take this one and then you're going to come back on. A question says, my child took gifted testing at the end of last year. The assistant principal said she's not allowed to release the scores yet. Do you know when scores will be available from last year's testing? I presume that would be COGAT testing, perhaps Torrance or Naglieri, but I assume the those results should be available by now, but I'll let you respond to that.
Well, I appreciate that. That's a great question. We do have outside vendors that will provide us with those scores. We have received those. However, IT has asked that they have a few weeks in order to upload that. Once they upload that and do their data scrub for any duplicates or any errors within that data file, they'll upload that, and then we'll share those instructions with the local school so that parents will already know coming into this new process that we speak on, they already know the outcome and status of their children.
So that will be soon, I presume.
Yes, it will.
Okay, last question, and then Ms. Atkinson, I'm going to take it back to you. I think you have a couple more slides to speak to. Question says, is gifted programming, again, services, is gifted services just for certain grade levels? K-12, students can become eligible for services in grades kindergarten through 12. So for clarity on that. So Ms. Atkinson, it is back to you, and we'll come back to some more questions in a little bit.
Okay. After the flow chart lists the assessment types that we utilize here in the district. So of course, our achievement assessment is the MAP assessment. And this year we're looking forward to utilizing all 3 assessment windows or administration windows. So that's fall, winter, and spring. As of fall 24, winter 25, and spring 25, those students will come forth as we described in the previous slide. I also want to share with you that we are bringing back, for those of us who have students that have been in the DeKalb County system, we are bringing back the Iowa Test of Basic Skills as our second screener for achievement. Again, those would be for those students who hit the MAP range of 75 to the 89th percentile. Mental ability, our district utilizes the cognitive ability test, so we'll use that one first. And again, that's will also be provided for students who meet the 90% or higher in creativity and motivation from the Renzulli. So again, talking about those additional opportunities or at-bats for students to come to the table to be screened for gifted services. Our creativity and motivation teacher observation instrument is our Renzulli. And again, that's for everything we're mentioning here is for all students in grades K through 11. Should our students having been screened from the MAP, COGAT, ITBS, and Renzulli, should we find that they still need additional assessments, DeKalb has that covered as well. Starting with our mental ability, we use the Naglieri, which is a the Naglieri nonverbal abilities test. It satisfies the mental ability, and these will be used for students who need a 3rd measure in meeting the state's 3 out of the 4. The Torrance test for creative thinking will satisfy our creativity domain. The GES will satisfy the motivation, as well as GPAs for our students in grades 6 through 12 will be used for motivation. Next slide. Of course, you all are wondering, we're doing all of these assessments, but what benefit is gifted education and what does it bring? Well, number one, it brings forth a teacher that has been either endorsed or by the district or through Metro Reza, but preferably here in DeKalb, because we have our own gifted identification, gifted endorsement program, or they possess their gifted certification. They are already trained individuals who will provide open-ended assignments that encourage critical thinking, problem solving, and creativity. These instructions should be based on the student's interest as well as their strengths. Instruction will be tiered, but also at a pace where it is meeting the ability and instructional needs of the student, and an opportunity for students to be with other like-minded peers. Next slide. I want to jump into our delivery models. These are the delivery models that our local schools have the autonomy to utilize at their discretion based on their gifted population, as well as the number of gifted certified teachers. All three delivery models, resource, advanced content, and cluster, must have a gifted certified and or an endorsed teacher in order to meet the needs of those students and consider it a gifted service. Let's start first with the resource. That is a pull-out model. It is only for gifted identified students. When I say pull out, I'm saying that teacher A may or may not have their gifted certification, but during a segment of the day or during a third period class, for reference, those children during third period will get up, leave that teacher, and then go be with another teacher to receive interdisciplinary thematic units based on interest and based off of the board approved curriculum for students to engage in exercises and experiences that are beyond the traditional scope. Cluster grouping, again, would be for those gifted students, but it can be in a class that is mixed ability, meaning students that have not obtained the gifted identification or the gifted label yet. Schools that have a small population and possibly a small number of teacher endorsed or gifted certified teachers would utilize this model in order to make sure that those needs are being met and those services. They are expected during those segments of the day, no more than 2 in cluster. They are supposed to have differentiated instructional strategies that are tiered and geared toward the strengths and interests of those students. Last but not least would be advanced content. This one would be where, again, it can be self-contained, but it also can be mixed ability as well, where gifted and non-gifted students are receiving instruction from a gifted certified teacher or endorsed teacher through their content area. This is in high school, you mostly will see this through your AP and IB placement. They may have a gifted segment as well, but this is where the pace and the scaffolding and tiering of instruction would definitely be occurring. Again, the autonomy is at the local school level for determining which one would best meet the best needs of their student, their population, contingent upon the number of gifted certified teachers they have in their building across those grade levels. Next slide.
Ms. Atkinson, actually, yeah, we're gonna pause there for a second. Again,
Sure.
So many great questions. We have far more questions than we're going to be able to answer this evening. So we're going to take note of all the questions, offer written replies, and provide those via our website in the coming week or two. But we'll get to as many as we possibly can this evening. One question that's come up a good bit is about other states. So I want to address this question. First of all, again, to be clear about something we mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, there is no reciprocity in Georgia in terms of gifted identification from other states. Some states do, some states don't. There's no federal requirement or expectation or statute that you do. There is no similarity whatsoever to what you may know to be the case for exceptional education and English learner services. Gifted is totally different. So the quick answer is, if your child was identified in another state as receiving gifted services in another state, the state of Georgia does not honor that, and your child would have to be assessed based on Georgia criteria, Georgia approved instruments, in order to then receive gifted services in Georgia. I'm not gonna rationalize or justify that response. My views on that are not relevant. That's by statute. That's how it is in our state. And you'll have to connect with your school administration about how your child can then be assessed using some of these instruments that we've talked about at the appropriate windows in the way that we talked about in this webinar that Ms. Atkinson referenced a few minutes ago. Also, there's a question about how does Georgia rank in terms of the quality of gifted programming compared to other states. Given that there is very little consistency from state to state in terms of how gifted education is defined, served, criteria, etc., what I can tell you is that one instrument that gives us some look at other states is MAP. MAP has a feature in which you can compare the performance of special programs, of special populations, I should say, of students, such as students receiving EL services, exceptional ed services, gifted services, against those in other places who are taking the MAP assessment at the same time. Some of us might be familiar with percentile rankings. How does my child's performance rank compared to other students who took the assessment at the same time? How much did my child grow or not grow compared to other students who took the assessment at the same time? MAP gives us that feature. We are working with the MAP company to utilize that feature in DeKalb County School District so that we can offer those same sorts of comparisons for how our special population students are performing compared to other populations elsewhere. So as this new MAP window concludes itself, I believe at the end of this week, if I recall, very soon we'll be able to have that comparative data that we haven't had in the past. There's another question here. Does Kittredge Magnet have a separate gifted program? So one thing I'll say with that, although we're not going to speak too much in depthly about individual schools this evening, so whereas Kittredge represents a magnet school for high achievers, I do want folks to understand, let's not convolute magnet programming with gifted education. Certainly, there are a number of students who qualify for our magnet programs who are also identified as gifted, but they are not one and the same. The magnet program for high achievers, Chamblee High School is another example, Chamblee Middle School is an example, Southwest DeKalb is an example, Arabia Mountain is an example. These schools, these magnet programs have different criteria altogether from what the state of Georgia requires for gifted education. So they are not one and the same. And so I would encourage a parent out there to connect with their local school's administrative team for more clarity on how gifted services are provided for at their school. The local administration should be able to answer that, including at Kittredge. One more question that we're going to come to Ms. Drake, I believe, is next. The question is about other counties in the state of Georgia. This person writes their child was in gifted education in Fulton County, now attending DeKalb County School District. Should my child continue gifted services? The answer to that question is yes. So from county to county in the state of Georgia, if your child received gifted services in another county, qualified for gifted services in another county, connect with your new school's local administrative team, make sure they have your child's educational records in full from the other school district, and those records indicating gifted identification would then automatically qualify your child to receive gifted services in DeKalb County, as that's a county to county transfer, not a state to state transfer. So the answer to the question would be yes. So I'm going to pause there. We'll come back to some more questions in a few. And Ms. Drake, I believe you are next.
Thank you very much. So before I talk about supporting your child at home, I'm going to talk about my role in supporting teachers. So one of my roles is to coordinate the gifted endorsement program, and the other is to lead professional development for teachers. So I'm going to talk about those two briefly so you have a better understanding of how we're serving your child's teacher. So I coordinate the Gifted Endorsement Program. That is a program that is certified by the Georgia Professional Standards Commission, or GAPSC. If you've ever looked up your child's teacher's name to see if they're certified in the field they're teaching, that's who certifies teachers in the endorsements programs. As Dr. Sauce said earlier, gifted is unique because it varies from state to state. So that's why that certification is so important to have our endorsement in the state of Georgia. So for example, a teacher who comes to me from Florida and says, oh, I got my gifted endorsement in Florida, can that work in Georgia? Unfortunately, it can't. And the reason that's important is because we want our teachers to be trained and well-versed in what Georgia defines as gifted and how they support students. So all the things that you've heard Mrs. Atkinson say this evening, a teacher who goes through the gifted endorsement program in DeKalb County or in anywhere in the state of Georgia is going to have those same that same background. For example, our course, just so you're aware, it's 200 hours. It is a big endeavor. It begins in September and runs through May. And the teachers it is a time commitment. So there are 4 courses. The first course, they're learning about the nature and needs of gifted learners. So as I shared with you earlier, the definition and the characteristics, they're going very in depth into what are examples of gifted students and the distinction between a gifted student and a high achieving student. Then we have a course on curriculum and strategies and methods and materials. So we're talking about what materials do you have to provide students and how are you using them instructionally for your students? And then the final of the 4 courses is on measurement and assessment. So it's teaching teachers what our assessments are, but not only just what the assessments are and what information they give you, but how are you using them to drive your instruction? So what are you doing differently in your classroom based on the data from your student? So the big thing that you need to know about gifted endorsement is if your child is receiving services in gifted education in a class, it means their teacher has either completed the gifted endorsement program or is actively enrolled in the gifted endorsement program. So they should be able to better serve your child's needs. The other thing you need to know is that they should be doing something different in their classroom as a result of the course. So this program has been examined and it's certified by the Georgia Professional Standards Commission. So one of the things that we do is we want it to affect the teacher's classroom. So it's not just about learning the information, it's about what are you doing differently in your classroom. So we have that we offer to our teachers in the district, and that program will be beginning soon. And the application deadline for teachers is coming up. It's actually next Sunday. But then I also want to tell you about another opportunity we have for teachers, and that's professional learning. So if teachers can't commit to the 200-hour course, we offer programs throughout the school year and in the summer for teachers to learn about what strategies work to meet the needs of their gifted learners. So I'm thrilled to say I offered 12 3-hour sessions this summer, and we had 476 teachers from across the district to come and participate. Again, these sessions are designed so that the teachers can go back and apply them in the classroom. So for each activity that we try, we talk about the implementation in the classroom. But what we've also added this year, thanks to Dr. Sauce, is we have 12 more full day sessions. So I'm going to be out in the schools leading full day sessions where anybody in the district can come and participate in an entire day session learning about identification and instruction of gifted students. But it doesn't stop there. We are here to support your teachers throughout the year. So we can connect with principals to come out and to support their schools with professional development for their entire staff, but we can do it with small groups of teachers and even individual teachers. So in addition to our school support, one of the teachers who attended this summer session, she said, the first week of school, would you come out and give me feedback? And so I got to go out that first week of school, not only give her feedback, but also team teach with her in the classroom. So I want you to know there's lots of support for your teachers to be able to meet the needs of your students. So now that I've shared that, now I'm going to talk to you about how you can support your child in the classroom. So definitely feed your child's love for knowledge by exploring other resources. So any topics that they're interested in, I want you to give them that time and the opportunity to explore those topics. And in a few minutes, I'm going to share some resources that you already have access to. encourage goal setting. That's a big part of what I do in my professional learning. Our professional learning covers topics such as questioning and discussion, but it also addresses feedback and how to differentiate with small groups and to feed your child love for knowledge. So that's the same kind of thing we want to do in our classroom. That's the same kind of thing we'd want you to do at home. So we encourage you to conduct teacher conferences to discuss your child's progress. So some of you already in the chat have commented on your child. We want you to set up conferences with your child to discuss your child's progress and what you and the teacher can do for your child. We encourage you to participate, to set up opportunities for your child to participate in weekend or summer programs. I want you to know that there are lots of opportunities in the DeKalb County School District for your students. So one of the things we ask our teachers in the gifted endorsement program to volunteer at events that are district-wide. There are lots of district-wide events that are available to your child, such as the Helen Ruffin Reading Bowl, the Technology Fair, Science and Engineering Fair. Those are opportunities you want to expose your child to. And then, of course, you'd want to connect your child with other like-minded children. So I'm going to share some resources that you already have access to. These resources are all provided by DeKalb County School District. They are available through Clever or Launchpad, and your child should be able to access them. But if they have any difficulty, you can tell your child, find out from your teacher what resources are available. But these are available through the district. One of them is Galileo. Galileo is a great website. And I want you to know that I'm going to highlight just six resources. But these resources, some of them are going to be great for elementary, some will be great for middle and high school, and some span all grade levels. So Galileo is one of my favorite go-to websites for actually teachers, but also for students. They have ebooks, they have encyclopedias. So again, feeding your child's love of knowledge. The World Book Encyclopedia, which is on the bottom right of your screen, is again another great resource for kids. It's an interactive encyclopedia, so it's for all ages and all abilities. They have videos, they have ebooks. There's lots for your child to explore. The other ones that we have available to your child are Mac and Via. Again, all of these websites have electronic books, but they also have things such as read-alongs and activities that your child can explore. Another one is Sora. Again, I can't say enough about read-alongs. One of the things that we've seen with fluency is when kids can see and hear words, they're going to better comprehend and improve their own fluency. And that works not just for struggling students, but all students with their reading comprehension and their fluency. And then, of course, Gale is another resource that is intended for your upper grade students, that it's those are your kids that you really want to empower some research skills, that is there for you. And PebbleGo and PebbleGo Next are great resources for elementary kids to explore topics of their choice. Again, these are all resources provided by DeKalb County School District, and they're all resources accessible through Clever or Launchpad. And if your child's teacher can't help you with these resources, your school librarian or your media specialist can help your child access these resources as well. But these are a great place to get your child started. And then we wanted to give you some parent resources. And somebody asked in the chat already, are these resources available all year, even in the summer? Yes, they are. Great question. And then finally, I wanted to leave you with some parent resources. The first place I would recommend is the Georgia Department of Education. So as we've said, again, gifted identification process and serving is different in the state of Georgia from other states. So if you want to see where we go to get our guidelines, that Georgia Department of Education website is your best site to do that. They also have resources to connect you with specifically for parents on that site. The National Association for Gifted Children is another website that you can explore, NAGC. Again, that's going to give you a national perspective. So that's just something to be aware of when you see things and you think, wait, Georgia's not that way. We've got to remember that every state has different criteria for identification. And finally, as Dr. Sash shared, we will have a way for you to access this information in the coming weeks. But the DeKalb County School District is a great site to have the resources specifically to DeKalb County School District. So if you wanted to see the flow chart for identification, that resource is there to help you as well.
Thank you for that, Ms. Drake. And along those lines, team, we're so appreciative about the high levels of engagement just with so many folks participating in this virtual webinar, and also the high numbers of questions we've received. Team, we have nearly 200 questions, so obviously far more than we have time to answer this evening. So we're gonna take the next 20-25 minutes or so and respond to as many questions as we can as we receive them. Also note that we have your email addresses by virtue of you registering for this webinar. So we're going to do our best to cluster the questions and then respond to them in writing. And we'll end up responding via email to all the folks who registered with our responses to the questions, along with this PowerPoint. So if you registered, we'll make sure you get this PowerPoint. The PowerPoint you'll get before the responses to the questions, because it's going to take us longer, obviously, to go through, parse through the questions and respond to them. And then that same website, web address that Ms. Drake just referenced on the DeKalb website. If you don't mind going back, I want to make sure parents can see that URL address. Thank you. At the bottom of the slide, you see the DeKalb URL address, www.dekabschoolsga.org/gifted. We'll end up posting this PowerPoint and responses to the questions at that same URL. Also, I want to remind everyone that your school, every school has a locally identified gifted liaison. And you are invited to, of course, connect with your school's administrative team to find out who the gifted liaison is. I suspect that on your school's website, your local school's website, you should also probably be able to identify who the gifted liaison is. So there, again, so much interest in this topic, so many great questions. We have this small but mighty team of myself and our two gifted coordinators, Ms. Drake and Ms. Atkinson. So, you know, there's other resources at the school level. There you go. Thanks for putting their contact on. There's other resources at the school level that can also help with particular questions you may have about your child's circumstances or particular to your school's gifted service models, that either your school administration and or your school's local gifted liaison could also be able to speak to more intimately about your school. So with questions, there's a lot of questions in that are presented about the identification process. If you could please go back several slides, I'll tell you when to stop. Keep going. A lot of questions around the same theme. Keep going. And one more. Stop there, please. No, go advance one more forward. There you go. Stop there, please. Okay. So there's a number of questions about gifted identification process. So I want to revisit this slide and provide a little bit more clarity on that. So first of all, as it relates to the MAP assessment is an assessment that is very widely used across America, where districts have an opportunity to identify students' skill levels, particularly in reading and math, at various points of the year. In most cases, in most districts, they're offering MAP 3 times a year, as is the case with DeKalb County school districts. Typically a window of time in the fall, a window of time in the winter, and a window of time in the spring. It just so happens that in the state of Georgia, the MAP assessment is one of several that is permissible for the achievement category. Now, again, going back to each state does giftedness differently. Some states may not utilize MAP for gifted identification. In Georgia, it is one of the options for the achievement category, but it's not the only option. The state of Georgia each year publishes a list of permissible instruments that school districts in Georgia can utilize for gifted identification in each of those domains, each of these categories you see on this slide: achievement, mental ability, creativity, motivation. There's usually 5 or 6 instruments that are available per category. Most districts don't use all of them. That's not practical. Most districts use 2 or 3 per category, and that's what's practical and feasible. In our district, no different. We use several per category. MAP is the first step, but it's not the only step. Quite frankly, it used to be the only way to get further consideration for giftedness in our district. It no longer is the case, but going forward, depending on how your child scores on the MAP assessment in either administration, whether it be fall, winter, or spring, if they score in the 90th percentile or above, they've already meet the criteria for the achievement category per state of Georgia regulations. So if they meet the 90th percentile or above, they're automatically going to be assessed for other domains, i.e. the COGAT, which is the mental ability category. And then in creativity and motivation, every teacher, every homeroom teacher in October completes the Renzulli observation checklist for their students, which assesses teacher observations in mental ability, in creativity and motivation. So that's happening anyways, whether your child's already identified for gifted or not. Really, it's the achievement category and the mental ability category that have these standardized instruments that are given at different times of the year. So if your child scores above the 90th percentile on the MAP assessment, they're automatically going to get the COGAT. If they don't score in the 90th percentile or above in the MAP, but they still do really well between the 75th and 89th percentile, which is still, exceptional achievement. It may not be the minimum requirement that the state of Georgia says is acceptable for gifted education, but it's still very, very high. In that scenario, this is new for us this school year. In that scenario, we will offer them the COGAT if they're scoring between the 75th and the 89th percentile. A question came up about when do these assessments happen? Good question, fair question. For MAP, there's a 2-week window in August. There's then a 2-week window in November, and there's then a 2-week window November, December, late November, early December. And then there's a 2-week window in March. So those are your 3 windows for MAP. For COGAT, which is your mental ability assessment, we have a window in October, and then we have a window in February. So the mental abilities, the COGAT, will come after the MAP assessments because, again, MAP is step 1, although not the only step and not the only avenue to get to gifted education, but it is step 1. So mental ability comes after that. There are other assessments that we use if a student scores really high in COGAT, but not quite enough in order to qualify for gifted education. There's another instrument called the Naglieri that we use for mental abilities as well. Likewise, in motivation, if they score really high on the Renzulli, but not quite well enough to qualify for gifted, we're giving additional at-bats with another instrument that it's called the Torrance. So there's nothing that a parent needs to do for the students to be given those opportunities to take those. It's based on how do they do at each juncture, but we're opening up more pathways, more avenues as before, as in ways that we've described this evening, and also in ways that we've presented to the board on May 6th of this year. Lastly, nope, I just want to make, I'm sorry, I'm glancing at questions while I'm answering. Yep, okay. Yeah, I think that's it. I wanted to speak to that and make sure that folks understood the timeline and the different instruments that are utilized for those categories. And bear with me, team. Again, we have more than 200 questions, so we're going to answer as many as we can over the next 20 minutes. The next one says, oh, there's one that says, how early do they test for gifted? So we're giving the MAP beginning in kindergarten. So the other assessments are available for kindergartners as well. And in the state of Georgia, kindergartners can qualify and receive gifted services. So this process begins in kindergarten. Okay. There's a score that says, how do you become aware if your child is accepted into gifted education? Great question. That should come with and through your local school administration, i.e. the teacher and or through the principal's office. But before your child would take any of these additional assessments I just referenced, whether it be the Naglieri, COGAT, Torrance, etc., you would have to sign off and give permission for your child to even be assessed on these additional instruments. So you would know that they're being further tested because you have to give your permission. And then it would be with and through your child's teacher and or principal's office to give results of those assessments. So there's a question here that says, what does served mean? Great question. So as we talked about, there are various service models that the state of Georgia allows for to demonstrate that children who are identified for gifted are actually receiving gifted services. So service served means that a child is participating in a classroom setting that is utilizing one of those approved service models. 3 of the ones that Ms. Atkinson spoke to earlier are cluster model, advanced content model, and resource model, which is the pull-out model. So it would mean that a child is actually experiencing one of those classroom settings from a teacher who has received their gifted endorsement and who is able to differentiate and provide for a differentiated learning experience for the gifted children that is in his or her classroom. That's what it means to be served. There's a question about when does this happen? I just spoke to the different timeframes during the year in which assessments happen. Next question says, are students identified as gifted typically exhibiting all or most of the characteristics that have been bulleted in the slides? I'm going to come back to you, Ms. Atkinson. How would you best answer, or how would you best advise a parent, speak to a parent about characteristics that we mentioned earlier, compared and contrasted to the categories that are identified in the state of Georgia for giftedness, and how could a parent navigate those characteristics and those categories and perhaps identify qualities of giftedness in their child?
Oh, wow. So great question. Does a child have to exude all of those? No, that was just a snippet of some of those, but those behaviors are very consistent. So while we referenced and shared some different ways in which those behaviors or characteristics may show up in a child, but also it's done to a degree where I almost get lost. Mrs. Drake shared a child that is an enthusiast and overly inquisitive. So that child is constantly, it's not just this one time because we went to someplace new and I have a bunch of wonders or questions around it, but I always do that, even if it's something I'm not familiar with. My grandmother has a box of pictures, and I began to wonder, who was this person? What were they like? What was the year? Those are the nuances that giftedness begins to separate themselves from a child that was just curious about it and they move on to something else. What do you do to foster that? Another thing, again, we didn't share an exhaustive list. Hopefully you will take time to go and visit those websites, share, especially from the Davidson Institute, because they do go into a little bit more in depth about some of these behaviors and what does that look like and how they show up. But also just want to draw you to the point where you also want to cultivate and foster it. So the more that those behaviors are fostered, welcomed, appreciated, valued, and here's another thing to build upon, and to build upon that, to again, to extend and stretch that learning and curiousness of a student, of your child. I think that would be the direction to go as a parent, that's something you can do that's inexpensive and doesn't cost you anything.
Thank you for that, Ms. Atkinson. There are several questions. I'm going to come to you, Ms. Drake. There are several questions about particularly the cluster service model and how a parent might know or recognize or might tangibly experience a differentiated learning experience for their child in that classroom setting. Could you, Ms. Drake, could you maybe speak to, particularly as the gifted endorsement process teaches, as your professional learning develops teachers to better understand and implement, could you talk about what should the differences look like, and how should the tangible different learning experiences manifest themselves, particularly in a cluster model classroom?
You know, I think it's interesting because even connecting to what Mrs. Atkinson said, the characteristics, she talked about how you'll see those character traits over and over in a child. And I think one of the things that we talk about, one of my favorite activities to do with teachers, is to talk about character traits you see with gifted kids. And a lot of times we'll get opposites. So we'll say, somebody will say introverted, and another person will say extroverted, and another person will say messy, or another will say organized. So what we talk about is differentiating to meet the needs, is knowing our kids and what we can do to better serve them. So I'm a big proponent of small group instruction. So what are you doing differently for your kids? Is it different? Are the activities different? Are the levels of the activities different? Are the texts different? What are you doing to connect with the students? So that would be a big area there where you'd see it, is the content or the delivery of the content that they have, how they're going to show an understanding might be different based on a small group of students or on an individual student. So how they show their understanding, but how they might access the information. Again, a lot of our resources the teachers have access to are leveled based on a child's reading level or readiness level. So you're going to see your child that they won't always be doing the same activity that every child does in the classroom. So we're really focusing on the individual child.
Thank you for that, Ms. Drake. I would also offer for parents who may have questions about their individual child's circumstances in their classroom, we would encourage you to connect with, particularly if you may already have a gifted child and you're not clear or it's not manifesting for you just yet as of what the differentiated learning experiences are looking like or should look like in your child's clustered classroom. We'd encourage you to connect with your child's teacher and ask those questions. There may be aspects of the learning environment or experience you're just not aware of yet, or your child may not even be aware of yet. Those are very fair questions to present and ask of your child's teacher and or your child's administrative team. But in the spirit of collaboration with our parents, clarity and transparency, we would encourage parents to seek that understanding. Again, if you already have a gifted child identified and you're not clear how that differentiated learning experience is unfolding for your child, those are fair topics of conversation with your child's teacher, including which of your children's teachers are gifted endorsed and the way your child's schedule is built, which segments of the day or which periods of the day is your child's gifted services being provided for. If you're not clear on that, again, if you already have a gifted child, we'd encourage you to connect with your child's teacher, teachers, and or counselor administrative team to get clarity on that. We're going to go on to some more questions here. Again, we're going to answer as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. And then work on presenting some written responses to what we can't get to and cluster them by topic, by subject in the not too distant future. Our students picked a test for gifted only by teachers. So to go back to our process that we spoke to earlier, MAP is the first step. And depending on how students perform on MAP is one way that they can walk in through door number 2. But another way they can walk into another door is how teachers rate them on the Renzulli instrument, the creativity and motivation categories. And we would encourage you, if you think your child is exhibiting characteristics of giftedness, you think your child may potentially be a candidate for giftedness, again, would encourage you to connect directly with your child's homeroom teacher, your child's counselor, your child's administrative team to further discuss them taking these other instruments. MAP is one way through the door. The Renzulli instrument we talked about, which is assessing students' exhibited behaviors in motivation and creativity, is another way, and through parent, through parent referral is another way. Another way that can be addressed at the local level. Again, each school has a gifted liaison that your child's principal, counselor, etc., can point you to, that you can have more conversation in depth about your child's situation with your school's gifted liaison. Great question. Question here says, how long does it take to receive results if your child has already been assessed for gifted and talented? Ms. Atkinson, can you speak to, in general terms, if let's say if they take, take Naglieri, ITBS, COGAT, or others, let's say in October and or February, what's a general time frame they might expect to get those results back from the school level?
So again, those are assessments that are, that data file has to be scrubbed once we receive it back from the outside vendor who does the scoring. And then typically through IT, who loads that into SIS Gifted, which then allows us to go through its automated processing system, which is filtered through the state regulations and guidelines for criteria, and assuring that we have identified the child appropriate based on either option A or option B. Typically, that should happen within the first 3 weeks of school. And so we are within that time range before parents begin to receive that information, because that was conducted for the last day of school when testing for gifted in the spring ended. So we will have those scores.
So our goal is that children that qualified in the spring of last year would begin being served this semester, and children that would qualify in the fall, this fall. And again, our window beyond MAP, the other assessments we spoke to will occur in September and early October. And then the goal would be children that would qualify in this fall window could then become served in the spring.
Yes.
Of course.
And then actually, because we would have taken the children through the entire process, by November, they could begin those services as early as January when they return from the school's winter break.
Okay, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
There's another question here about why Georgia does not accept transfer of gifted recognition from other states. You know, the best answer I could give is that just by statute in Georgia, giftedness is defined in a particular way. I'm certainly not an expert on other state statutes or approaches to gifted education. You know, done my own study on this topic, but not an expert on other states. But the bottom line is that giftedness is not governed at the federal level the way special education, Section 504, English learners programming are. And so you have states that do it in different ways. Some states do offer reciprocity, some states don't. Georgia's one that does not. So that's the best answer I could give. And that has nothing to do with local policy for DeKalb County School District. It doesn't matter what school your child might attend in the state of Georgia. If they were identified as gifted in another state, that district, whether DeKalb or not, would still require your child to have Georgia's identification procedures in order for your child to receive gifted services. There's another question about the difference between gifted and high achiever. We spoke to that a few minutes ago, but just to kind of rehash briefly, many districts have a variety of magnet programming, and your magnets can be based on different themes, different educational themes. In DeKalb County School District, one of those themes is high achiever magnets. So the assumption being that those students are academically high achieving. In DeKalb County School District, there's a combination of specific GPA requirements, along with at least scoring on the 75th percentile or above on MAP in math and reading for our high achiever magnets. That is not the same criteria and not the same as gifted education. Folks can sometimes convolute those. They are not the same. Gifted education is students qualifying for and being identified for gifted services based on the state of Georgia's criteria, which we've discussed quite a bit this evening. And then if they do qualify, then they receive educational services for that giftedness in the way of a gifted endorsed teacher, at least 5 periods, 5 segments per week through one of the approved service models, some of which we've discussed this evening. In a high achieving magnet program, if your student qualified, then they would be in a separate educational setting. It might be a school such as Kittredge. It might be a program such as Chamblee High School or Southwest DeKalb High School, Chamblee Middle School. And you have students that are scheduled with other high achievers that are receiving instruction for teachers that are specific for that magnet program. Whereas there certainly can be gifted students who participate in the magnet programming. They are not the same and they are not synonymous. So succinctly, that's the best answer I can give, given the time constraints. Gonna hit a few more questions here. We're getting close to 7:30. Has the district taken steps to address equity considerations in the identification of gifted students? So yes, again, I would encourage anyone who has interest in this topic to go back and view our school board meeting on May 6th of 2024. In the beginning of each school board meeting, or towards the beginning, is the superintendent's report. It's usually the first 15, 20 minutes of the school board meeting. On May 6th of this year, myself and this mighty gifted team presented to our Board of Education historical data around disproportionality that has existed in our school district's gifted participation. And we presented ways that we seek to address that disproportionality by opening up more and different pathways for more and different historically underserved and underrepresented students to be considered for gifted education. Much of that you've learned about this evening in the way of additional pathways that we've already spoken about. With that also being said, we don't have any ability to control or change or require the state to go about gifted identification differently. Of course, in our state, we are required to adhere to State Board of Education regulations. So regardless of how one may feel or not feel about how the state of Georgia goes about identifying gifted students, we do have some local control about how many opportunities we provide and under what conditions and circumstances we provide those opportunities. And so that's what we're doing. And that's what a good bit of this presentation has been about. But if you want to learn more about this particular aspect of the conversation, I would encourage folks to view the May 6th board meeting, the first 15 or 20 minutes. in which we do a deeper dive into the disproportionality and equity matters of this conversation. Let's see here. Again, we're going to get to one or two more here before we sign off. There's a question about when is testing done. We spoke to that. MAP testing, which is kind of the first step, is August, November, December, and then March. And then we have a September and then a February window for the additional assessments we discussed beyond MAP. Why has the district used MAP as the sole gatekeeper for further gifted evaluation? Other districts and other states administer COGAT and further gifted screening to all students. Thank you for that question. To go back to some points that we just offered a few minutes ago, we are no longer using MAP as the sole identifier, the sole gatekeeper. As we talked about in this presentation, and we also dive deeper in that May 6th presentation to our Board of Education, we are using other avenues to consider children for gifted and more often, more frequently during the year. That's what we get into some in this presentation. So MAP is not the only sole gatekeeper. I'll tell you that it used to be for our school district as of last school year. It no longer is, based on a variety of the pathways that we discussed in this presentation. The question also speaks to administering the COGAT for all students. That's not where we are today. We may further consider that route down the road. It's just not where we are today. But it doesn't mean we couldn't further consider that down the road. We're going to get to one more question. If a child is tested for gifted, will we be told if they do not meet qualifications, and will we be told what qualifications they did or did not meet? So Ms. Atkinson, I'll let you speak to that. I presume the answer is yes. Of course, parents would find out if their children, were assessed. Of course, they gave permission, and then what the results were and whether or not they qualified and why they did or didn't qualify.
Standard operating procedures at the local school level. A child whose parent has consented for them to go through the entire program, once a determination has been made whether they are eligible, ready for services, or not eligible at this time, parent notification is given. But what we want to do is make sure that all data sets that are appropriately reflected and are indicative and displayed in all 4 domains as shared in this presentation are given to the parent.
Okay. Thank you for that. One more question, similar in the vein of what we talked about before. There's a question about how we're seeking to provide more equitable services across all schools around giftedness. It's a fair question. One thing that we'll offer, we didn't speak to in this webinar, but we get into in the board presentation I referenced several times, is that we are opening up and earmarking more slots for our gifted endorsement programming for teachers from our underrepresented areas, our geographically underrepresented areas of the district. Principals and teachers around the district know about that, so that we can have more consideration for teachers who teach in schools that historically have less gifted endorsed teachers. I'll also offer that we are facilitating a conversation around gifted education that just quite frankly hasn't happened on the macro level or on the wide scale in our school district community really in a long time. That includes getting in front of principals, which we've already done in the last several weeks, to re-inform, re-educate, build the capacity of our principals about the understandings of gifted education, what to look for, how best to assess, monitor, measure, support teachers who are teaching gifted classes or teaching gifted segments. Again, seeking to have more teachers be endorsed. We're collaborating with our IT department more than we ever have before to review in real time whether list of students A, B, and C who are identified for gifted in a school are actually receiving the services. And when and if they're not in real time, then our team, our small but mighty team, connecting with the principals of those schools to offer more support, more guidance to make sure that students who are identified are actually being served. These are steps that we just haven't undertaken en masse in the recent past, just for reasons around logistics, around how we were configured, around needing more infrastructural support in the way of how our organization is designed. And this new division that we spoke of, which we represent on this call, is better equipped, better situated to offer that kind of support in a way that just wasn't happening as abundantly before. But we're reflective, we're forthright about where we know we need to improve our supports. And that's what this conversation represents, with more to come. Team, if you're wondering, we have 2 more scheduled webinars such as this school year. One is November 12th. The one after that is January 21st. In collaboration with our communications department, we will, of course, promote and advertise when that's approaching, so that folks who may want to log in for a round 2 can. There likely would be some repetition of content, but we want to just make ourselves as accessible as we can be for this conversation, to hear more questions and make sure as many people as are interested can hear the same information. So we're going to log off here momentarily. We will, via email, provide all those who registered with the PowerPoint. We will also put it on our website, on our gifted tab, and we will then get back to folks with responses to these questions in categorical format in the coming week or 2. We had just about 200 questions in total, so we'll certainly need some time to go through those, create topical categories, and to respond to them as best we can. And then we'll also provide via email the responses to those questions. So that is all we got for this evening. Ms. Drake, final thought. Ms. Atkinson, final thought.
Thank you. I appreciate your interest in the program. I loved it. One of the comments was, oh, that endorsement course sounds great. Could we do it for parents? Now you've got my wheels turning on how else we can support parents. So thank you for that.
Ms. Atkinson?
Again, this has been phenomenal. Over 400, almost 500 participants to talk to us and ask questions and to learn more about what we're doing in DeKalb. So what better way to wrap up almost hump day with getting some clarity, gaining, empowering you as parents, what those look scores are in your own child, as well as how to advocate for them at the local school level, and partnering with us. So I thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you, everybody. And as we log off again, team, please give us some time to respond in written fashion to all the questions, but look out soon for the PowerPoint. Again, November 12th is the next one of these with similar content. January 21st after that, similar content. Hope you have a wonderful evening, and thank you for your participation tonight.